Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Konoha Reviews. Today we have another retro review of a classic game that was recently released as a somewhat remaster with both its sequel and the original in the same package. Shenmue 1 and 2 are considered some of the highest praised cult classics in gaming history. For the time of its release, namely the end of 1999 in Japan and 2000 in the rest of the world, this was one of the most ambitious games that was way ahead of its time. But its incredible budget of over $40 million, which at the time was the most expensive game ever made, and lack of sales made the series inevitably a huge flop, and for 13 years, a third sequel seemed out of the question. Though the Steam purchase that I own has both Shenmue 1 and 2 in the package, today I will only focus on the first iteration. Shenmue 2 will be done in a separate video. When I was a little kid, I never had a Dreamcast, though I had the other consoles in the forms of a PS1 and a Nintendo 64. Seeing as footage of the game was already available in 1999, the sheer graphical essence of Shenmue blew me away when I saw it. I mean, one should compare games on the PS1 or Nintendo 64 that came around that time, and when one were to put that next to Shenmue, it was clear that the Dreamcast was a huge step forward. I had never seen a game that was this cinematic and resembling a movie. Later in life, I would play games and fall in love with game franchises that were undoubtedly inspired by Shenmue in the form of Yakuza, Deadly Premonition, and Persona. But the real important question was, now that I would play the game that started it all, if Shenmue could stand the test of time. For the fanboys regarding Shenmue, I might have some bad news, since the first 10 minutes of the game were agony, followed by the game actually becoming quite good, only to end as an absolute boring drag during the last third act. The story of Shenmue centers around our young protagonist Ryo Hazuki, a senior high schooler who never seems to go to school and is present when his father is killed by martial arts using Lan Di. Lan Di steals a valuable and mythical object from the Hazuki family, and the rest of the story centers around Ryo finding out the whereabouts of Lan Di to get his revenge. The game starts 4 days after this incident, as Ryo wakes up in his own house. So the first 10 minutes of the game were absolutely appalling to me. This was purely because of the horrid controls. Though later in the game I fared a bit better controlling Ryo on the open streets, in the small corridors of his own house, controlling him is an absolute nightmare. Rarely have I played games where the controls feel so stiff and awkward. It cannot even be compared to tank controls. I've said multiple times that rather than a tank, it feels like you are controlling a truck instead of a person. You can literally push on the right trigger to make Ryo walk or sprint, and just steer left or right, which makes him sway in that direction. What else really annoyed me was how slow the gameplay mechanic was of interacting with several objects. Though admittedly, it is quite impressive in how many objects you can actually interact with for its time, most interactions literally had no purpose. You could open shelves, drawers, boxes, look behind paintings, inspect items closer, etc. Though you can find some handy items like a flashlight and a key, most drawers or walls behind paintings and scrolls did not contain anything. Again, this probably was a feature that was quite impressive back in the day, but now it just makes it feel like a drag, especially since the animation is so slow. So I was really fearful that I would really dislike Shenmue during the first 10 minutes. Granted, I wasn't too sure what kind of game it was going to be. I knew there would be quick-time events and fighting, so I expected a somewhat Yakuza-esque action game light. But what I was pleasantly surprised by was that the game turned out to be an honest detective game. With the help of a useful notebook, you will always get updated on your current objectives or clues on what to do or where to go. You will often get updates in your notebook after talking to certain people, and the amount of different dialogue that the inhabitants had was quite impressive. But let's take a step back before we head deeper into the detective mechanic, and let's talk about the world itself. Though the game itself of course looks old, it still looks pleasing to the eye as it offers a quite believable world of Yokosuka set in 1986. Since I have been living here in Japan for over 7 years, it is very recognizable as the type of houses, but also the convenience stores or the small urban parks look somewhat the same nowadays in the more rural areas. The game has a 24-hour daily cycle where NPCs wake up and get to their work and even have routines like going out for lunch or spending some time at the park. Now, truth be told, we had already seen a time cycle in games like Majora's Mask, but we had not seen it on this scale yet. The cool thing is that it also keeps track of the date. You start out at the beginning of December, and if you have trouble with getting objectives done, you can always continue your search the next day. In the end, I believe you have more than 3 in-game months to complete the around 10-hour-ish campaign, though I managed to complete it within the first month. As you play day in day out, you will really get to know all the districts, like the sprawling shopping area of Dobuita, full of life and people to talk to and get to know. But even though the world and the amount of written dialogue was quite impressive and still holds up today, what is absolutely terrible is the game's voice recording. And I'm not only talking about the terrible voice acting that the game is notorious for, and in some ways is actually to be considered so bad it's good. The quality of the voice recordings, both in Japanese and English, is terrible, to the point where I would argue that the Japanese is worse. I played the game in Japanese since the story takes place in Japan, and I was happy to find out that the characters that are supposed to be Chinese or other foreigners were indeed portrayed by actual foreign actors. It gave a nice touch, though their Japanese is hilariously corny and bad. They throw in an English word now and then, which just makes it seem all the more tacky. But to get back on the subject of bad voice recording, many times the audio will peak, especially with audio recordings from child characters. Annoying rush can be heard as the sound peaks, and it is constant throughout the entire game, and also applies to a lot of voice recordings by the adults. Though it can be said that the Japanese voice actors do a bit of a better job of voice acting, it is nothing to write home about. For the English version, I do have to say that I like Ryo's voice a lot. Though his acting might be quite stiff and unresponsive or unemoting at times, it is quite a calm voice that is nice to listen to. Now back to the gameplay and my happiness on finding out that it was a detective game. You will be tasked with finding many different clues. In the beginning, all you have to go by is the sighting of a black car. You will talk to several citizens who will direct you to others, and eventually one of them will give you a location or a name of a specific person you can visit. The next clue reveals that the people in the black car were Chinese, so now your new task is to find out more about the Chinese inhabitants of the town. You rinse and repeat and ask the shop owners and pedestrians about tips, and they send you to places where eventually you will get your next clue and need to ask for help again. This plays like your typical adventure game where the focus is really on storytelling and talking with all these characters. I absolutely love this. The cutscenes might be considered a bit slow-paced to some, but the amount of different characters you interact with is still quite impressive today. In between talking and searching for clues, you will sometimes encounter some more action-packed sequences as you get your hands dirty fighting thugs in combat that feels like Virtua Fighter, as this was supposed to be considered a Virtua Fighter adventure game. Other segments that are a bit more action-packed are the earlier labeled QuickTime events. Being amongst the first of its time, they were revolutionary, as you had some form of gameplay while looking at a cool cinematic. What impressed me the most was that if you failed a certain QTE prompt, that more often than not, it would not necessarily mean that you were game over. They actually showed the animation for you failing, for example, Ryo tripping over garbage or getting punched in the stomach before moving on with the rest of the cutscene. This is very impressive, since there were games that came out a decade later that still had not implemented this, as you would be game over immediately for missing only one prompt, resulting in a very frustrating and boring gameplay. Lastly, you sometimes need to wait until a certain time before a location is accessible for Ryo, and in the meantime, the player can occupy themselves with several activities, though I do have to admit it is not enough to justify the amount of times you have this free time. You can head over to the arcade and play some video games or darts, which is pretty cool, but the number of games that is available is not that high. Then you can go to several gacha machines and try your luck on getting collectibles, but after getting a few that became monotonous as well. Again, I am sure that were I to play this game back in the day, it would have blown my mind. So much interactivity in a 3D world had never been done, and just the fact that you could walk up to a soda machine and get a drink was something no one had ever seen before. But today, we've seen interactivity done way better, and in some ways the world just feels empty and boring in terms of stuff that there's to do. It made me once again realize that it's not necessarily graphics or interactivity of its world that make games feel timeless, but it all comes down to gameplay and controls, since a game like Mario 64 stands the test of time way better and is 10 times uglier. Regardless of the emptiness of things to do though, I had a very good time with the story alone, and finding the next hint as I felt like a true detective. But alas, it would not last, and the worst had yet to come. During the third and final act of the game, Ryo makes his way to the harbor as he finds some hints that the game's antagonist is linked to the Chinese mafia and on his way to Hong Kong. In order to snoop around at the dock, Ryo finds himself a job as a forklift driver. First, let's talk about the docks themselves. Where the urban areas were beautifully crafted, with lots of different people doing their daily thing and just oozing atmosphere, the dockyards are just a grey mess, feeling like an empty open space. It is uninspired and unimaginative, as it just consists of many warehouses that all look the same. Many of the same character models and even stores also get teleported here for no reason, really emphasizing that by this time, the studio ran out of money. It is such a distinct difference between the areas of the first two-thirds of the game that it really makes the quality drop staggeringly. The action segments are all very poorly done, as they simply come down to a co-worker being harassed by the same characters over and over and over. The story really comes to a halt, but the one thing that boggles the mind, and now that I have played the full game, cannot understand how possibly Shenmue fans can defend this segment, is the forklift sections. Once Ryo gets a job as a driver, every morning for at least 5 days straight, he will be expected to participate in a race around the docks. The race takes 3 laps, and you are racing against 4 other opponents. Though it is quite amusing the first time you play this, and I also had a good time the second day since I then finally managed to become first, it was absolute hell to do the exact same race again 3 times after that. Again, the route never changes, neither does the AI, opponents, or cutscenes for that matter. It is incredibly boring and utterly mindless, and just feels like an excuse to make the game feel longer. Though games like Yakuza have mini-games that might not be very large in scale, at least it is not mandatory. But in Shenmue, the races are mandatory, and were just ridiculous as you were expected to do the same race 5 times, each with 3 laps, so have fun racing around the same circle 15 times in total. Now you can get different prices depending on your position in the end, but that is an absolute sad excuse to justify playing through the race multiple times. But hold on people, because we are not done yet. After the race each morning, you are expected to work as well. The work consists of very simple tasks. You pick up crates at spot A and bring them to spot B. You have a quota to fulfill in order to get a raise, and these often consist of moving 8 to 10 crates. It is very monotonous and incredibly boring. Though it might be somewhat okay or ironically funny the first time you play this segment, the fact that you have to do this 5 times too is mind-blowingly bad. I've read that there are people who really like this segment, saying that it's relaxing or therapeutic, but I would argue that a game like European Truck Driver fits that bit much better, as at least there you can get a change of scenery throughout a constant flow of moving. Here it is the same repeating movement of getting between point A and B and dropping and lifting the crates. Now granted, you actually do not have to abide by the quota to often move the story along, but some story segments only get triggered if you have delivered a certain number of crates, and some mandatory story cutscenes that are necessary for completing the game are only triggered if you are carrying cargo. Again, it just feels like these working segments have been added to lengthen the game as they were running out of budget. It's just bad gameplay mechanics. You are expected to work until 5 PM, meaning that I was often done with my quota 2 or 3 hours ahead of time. This meant that I just had my character wait for several in-game hours until the clock rang that I could leave. Surely that was not what the creators had intended to. All in all, I think that getting rid of this section or simply having it only in there for 1 or 2 days would have benefited the game greatly, as it really made the game less of a product. From what I can see, Shenmue 2 has a lot more varied stuff to offer, so hopefully I will not run into the same problems there. In the end, I can say that Shenmue does not stand the test of time, and is not really shining as it once was. Though we have a lot to thank for it obviously, games like Yakuza stand the test better thanks to better controls and more varied things to do. Shenmue is plagued by horrible controls, terrible sound design, and a really boring and monotonous third act in the harbor. What saves it though is the awesome story that offers a cool mystery to be solved as you work your way through the adventure as a detective with your trusty notebook. Were it not for that notion, then I would have called the game an absolute flop. But I love that segment so much that it saves the game and eventually will get a 7.4 rating. Shenmue is praised by so many, and once more, if I were to play this when it came out when I was a kid, it would have blown my mind with how revolutionary it was. But even then still, I think I probably would have hated the harbor section and would love to know exactly how Shenmue fans defend this particular part of the game. Though the sound design is bad, the music is very pretty, and the orchestral score that played during Ryo's departure towards Hong Kong even had me a bit of goosebumps goodness in the end. It definitely made me intrigued on the continuation of the story, and will let you all know how my adventure continued in Hong Kong in a different video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video and channel with your friends. Thanks!